The reason you feel alone isn't because something is wrong with you, but because there's something rare about you. Rare empaths don't lose people by accident, they outgrow them. They see too much, feel too deeply, and refuse to live in fake connections. And here's the part most people won't tell you: narcissists can sense this. At first, they're drawn to your light. But the moment they realize they can't control you, everything changes. So why do rare empaths end up with no friends? Is it loneliness, or is it actually a hidden kind of power? In this video, you'll discover the silent gift of your inner depth, the unseen strength most people overlook, and the truth about why your circle keeps getting smaller, but your awareness keeps getting stronger. Watch till the end, because one of these truths might completely change how you see yourself. And if something here feels a little too accurate, don't just scroll away, drop a quiet "I feel this" in the comments and subscribe, because some messages aren't meant for everyone, only for those ready to see. Solitude for a rare empath is often misunderstood from the outside. It can look like rejection, like loneliness, like something is missing. But in reality, it is a quiet form of selection. Rare empaths do not struggle to connect. They struggle to connect with what feels inauthentic. Their emotional awareness is so refined that they can sense the difference between genuine warmth and forced energy, between honest connection and hidden intention. This is why their circle tends to grow smaller over time, not larger. It is not because people leave them. It is because they begin to see clearly who truly belongs in their space and who does not. They notice the subtle inconsistencies in behavior, the emotional gaps in conversations, the moments where words and actions do not align. And once they see it, they cannot unsee it. This deep filtering is not something they consciously try to do. It happens naturally, almost instinctively. Their energy simply does not settle in environments that feel heavy, draining, or superficial. They may try at first, giving chances, offering understanding, even overextending themselves to maintain harmony. But eventually, something within them pulls back. It is not anger, and it is not pride, it is alignment. Their inner world begins to reject what does not match their depth. Conversations that stay on the surface start to feel exhausting. Relationships built on convenience rather than truth begin to feel empty. And slowly, without drama or confrontation, they step away. To others, this withdrawal can seem confusing. Some may interpret it as distance or coldness, not realizing that it is actually a form of self-respect. Rare empaths are not pushing people away. They are choosing not to abandon themselves anymore. They understand, often through painful experience, that constantly pouring into the wrong connections leaves them depleted. So they become more intentional. They listen more closely to how they feel around certain people. They pay attention to whether they feel seen or simply tolerated, valued or merely used. And when something feels off, they no longer ignore it just to keep the peace. This is where solitude begins to transform. It stops feeling like isolation and starts becoming clarity. In their own space, away from noise and emotional confusion, rare empaths reconnect with themselves. They regain energy, they reflect, they grow. Solitude becomes a place where they can breathe without having to adjust, explain, or shrink. It becomes a space where their sensitivity is not a burden but a strength. And over time, they begin to prefer this peace over the chaos of forced connections. The truth is, rare empaths do not have fewer relationships because they are unworthy of connection. They have fewer because they are no longer willing to accept connections that do not meet them at their level of depth. Their solitude is not empty, it is selective. It is a quiet boundary, a form of emotional intelligence that protects their energy and honors their truth. And while it may look like they are alone, what they are actually doing is waiting, not for more people, but for the right ones who can meet them without masks, without games, and without the need to pretend. For a rare empath, emotional depth is not just a personality trait. It is the lens through which they experience everything. Conversations are not simply about exchanging words. They are about meaning, intention, and feeling. This is why surface-level bonds often feel unsatisfying, even exhausting. Small talk, casual chatter, and forced laughter may seem normal to others, but to an empath, it can feel empty, like participating in something that lacks truth. They are not trying to be distant or difficult. They simply crave something real, something that goes beyond appearances and polite conversations. They want to understand and be understood, to connect in a way that feels genuine rather than performative. Because of this, they often find themselves out of sync with the world around them. In social settings, where conversations stay light and interactions remain shallow, they may feel disconnected even when surrounded by people. It is not that they cannot engage, they can, and often they do, but it drains them over time. There is a quiet awareness within them that something is missing, a deeper layer that is never reached. While others may be content with brief exchanges and surface-level friendships, empaths naturally search for depth, for honesty, for conversations that reveal something real about a person's inner world. This need for authenticity shapes their relationships in a powerful way. They are drawn to people who are open, self-aware, and emotionally honest. They value vulnerability not as weakness, but as a sign of truth. However, not everyone is comfortable operating at that level. Many people protect themselves with masks, avoiding deeper topics or deflecting emotional honesty. When an empath senses this, they instinctively pull back. It is not judgment, it is recognition. They understand, often without words, that the connection cannot go where they need it to go. Over time, this creates a pattern. They meet people, try to connect, but realize the bond does not go beyond the surface. So they step away, not with resentment, but with quiet acceptance. This is why they may appear alone, even when they have had many opportunities to build friendships. The truth is, they are not rejecting people. They are rejecting connections that do not feel real. And because true, soul-level connections are rare, their circle remains small. There is also a certain loneliness that comes with this depth. Not because they lack people, but because it is difficult to find those who truly understand them. They may long for conversations that go deeper, for someone who can meet them in that space without fear or hesitation. But rather than forcing connections that do not feel right, they choose to wait. They would rather stand alone in their truth than lose themselves in something shallow. In the end, their emotional depth is both a gift and a filter. It protects them from meaningless connections, but it also narrows the number of people they can truly bond with. What looks like isolation from the outside is often a quiet form of integrity. They are not here for surface-level interactions. They are here for something deeper, something real. And until they find it, they remain exactly where they are, not lost, not broken, but simply unwilling to settle for anything less than a connection that truly reaches the soul. There is a pattern that often goes unnoticed, until it repeats itself enough times to become clear. Narcissists are naturally drawn to empaths in the beginning, almost as if they can sense something valuable within them. It is the warmth, the openness, the ability to listen without judgment, and the genuine care that empaths offer so freely. To a narcissist, this feels like the perfect source of attention and validation. In those early moments, the connection can seem intense, even special. The empath feels seen, appreciated, sometimes even deeply understood. But what they are actually experiencing is not true connection. It is attention being mirrored back to them in a way that keeps them engaged. As time passes, something begins to shift. The same empath who was once open and giving starts to notice small inconsistencies, words that do not match actions, subtle manipulation, emotional push and pull. Unlike others, empaths do not ignore these signals for long. Their awareness begins to rise, and with it, their boundaries start to form. They may question things, step back, or simply stop reacting in the way the narcissist expects. And this is where the dynamic changes completely. A narcissist is not drawn to connection. They are drawn to control. When they realize that the empath cannot be easily influenced, that their emotions cannot be played with as expected, frustration begins to build. The same qualities they once admired, sensitivity, awareness, emotional depth, now become obstacles. The empath is no longer easy to predict, no longer easy to manipulate, and for someone who relies on control to maintain their sense of power, this becomes uncomfortable. At this point, the narcissist often responds in one of two ways. They either pull away, losing interest because the connection no longer serves their need for control, or they shift into more aggressive behavior. This can show up as criticism, blame, or subtle attempts to break the empath's confidence. It is not random. It is a reaction to losing influence. The empath, however, begins to see through it. What once felt confusing starts to make sense. The emotional highs and lows, the inconsistency, the sudden change in behavior, all of it becomes clearer. This is usually the moment where the empath chooses differently. Instead of chasing the connection or trying to fix what feels broken, they step back, not out of anger, but out of understanding. They recognize that what they were drawn to was not real in the way they thought it was. And more importantly, they realize that their energy deserves something genuine, not something that depends on control or illusion. What makes this dynamic powerful is not the initial attraction, but the eventual awakening. Narcissists may be drawn to empaths, but they are also repelled by what they cannot dominate. And empaths, once aware, no longer stay where they are not respected. What begins as attraction often ends as distance, not because the empath lost value, but because they discovered it. For a rare empath, silence is not weakness, and it is not avoidance. It is a deliberate form of strength. While many people feel the need to explain, defend, or argue to prove their point, empaths often reach a moment where they realize that not every situation deserves their voice. They understand that when someone is committed to misunderstanding, no amount of explanation will create clarity. So instead of engaging in endless back and forth, they choose stillness. And that stillness carries more weight than words ever could. Their silence is not empty, it is observant, aware, and deeply intentional. When faced with manipulation, emotional games, or toxic behavior, empaths begin to withdraw rather than react. They stop over-explaining, stop defending themselves, and stop trying to fix what was never their responsibility. This shift can feel sudden to others, especially to those who were used to the empath's patience and willingness to engage. But what has really changed is not the empath's care, it is their awareness. They begin to see that constant reaction only feeds the very patterns that are draining them. To a manipulator, This silence is unsettling. They are often used to provoking a response, to pulling emotional reactions that give them a sense of control. When the empath no longer participates in that dynamic, it disrupts the entire pattern. There are no arguments to twist, no emotions to exploit, no words to turn against them. The absence of reaction creates a kind of mirror, reflecting the behavior back without interference. And in that space, the truth becomes harder to hide. Toxic patterns that once operated quietly begin to stand out more clearly, not because the empath exposed them directly, but because they stopped covering them with their energy. This is why silence can feel louder than any confrontation. It sends a message without needing to be spoken. It says, "I see what this is, and I choose not to engage." It creates distance without drama, boundaries without conflict. And for the empath, it brings a sense of peace that arguing never could. Instead of being pulled into cycles of tension and emotional exhaustion, they step back into their own center. They protect their energy by refusing to give it where it is not respected. There is also a deeper level to this silence. It is a form of self-trust. Empaths often spend a long time doubting their instincts, questioning whether they are overreacting or misunderstanding a situation. But when they choose silence, it often means they have reached clarity. They no longer need validation from the other person. They no longer need to be understood by someone who is unwilling to understand. Their quiet withdrawal becomes a statement of confidence in what they feel and what they know to be true. In the end, their silence is not about shutting others out. It is about no longer abandoning themselves. It is a boundary that does not need to be announced, a form of communication that does not rely on words. And while it may confuse those who expect reactions, it ultimately reveals everything that needs to be seen. For a rare empath, the world is never just what it appears to be on the surface. Every interaction carries layers, tone, energy, intention, and they feel it all, often without trying. While others may focus only on words, empaths notice what sits beneath them: the hesitation in a voice, the inconsistency in behavior, the subtle shift in mood that no one else seems to register. It is not something they switch on or off. It is a constant awareness, a sensitivity that quietly scans every environment they step into. This ability to pick up on what others ignore can feel like both a gift and a burden. On one hand, it gives them deep insight into people. They can sense when something is off, even when everything looks fine on the outside. They can feel unspoken tension in a room, recognize when someone is hiding their true feelings, or detect when kindness is not as genuine as it seems. But on the other hand, this constant awareness can become overwhelming. It is like hearing multiple conversations at once, feeling emotions that are not entirely their own, and processing energies that others remain completely unaware of. In social environments, this can create a sense of distance. While others are relaxed and engaged, empaths may feel overstimulated, trying to make sense of everything they are picking up. A simple gathering can feel emotionally crowded, not because of the number of people, but because of the number of energies present. They may smile, participate, and appear present, but internally, they are navigating far more than what is visible. Over time, this can lead to exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from physical activity, but a deeper, emotional fatigue that builds from constantly absorbing and processing what others overlook. This is also why they may withdraw more often than expected. It is not that they dislike people. It is that being around too much unfiltered energy becomes draining. They need space to reset, to return to their own emotional state without interference. Solitude becomes a place where the noise quiets down, where they can separate what they feel from what they have absorbed. Without that space, it becomes difficult to stay grounded. There is also a certain isolation that comes with this level of awareness. It is hard to explain to others what they experience, especially when most people do not perceive the same depth. They may feel misunderstood or even dismissed when they try to express what they sense. So instead, they often keep it to themselves, learning to navigate their inner world quietly. This silence is not secrecy, it is self-protection. In the end, feeling everything others ignore shapes how empaths move through life. It sharpens their intuition, deepens their understanding, but also requires them to be more selective about where they place their energy. What seems like distance or withdrawal from the outside is often just balance. They are not avoiding connection, they are managing intensity, and in doing so, they protect the very sensitivity that allows them to see and feel the world in a way that few others can. For a rare empath, growth is not just a phase, it is a continuous, often intense process of becoming more aware, more aligned, and more honest with themselves. And as this inner transformation unfolds, something inevitable begins to happen. They start to outgrow people, not in a way that is arrogant or dismissive, but in a quiet, almost unavoidable way that comes from seeing life differently than they once did. Relationships that once felt natural begin to feel forced. Conversations that once felt engaging start to feel repetitive or empty, and the connections that once brought comfort slowly begin to feel misaligned. This shift usually begins with healing. As empaths work through their past experiences, especially those where they overgave, overextended, or tolerated less than they deserved, they start to recognize patterns. They become more aware of their own needs, their own boundaries, and the kind of energy they are willing to allow into their lives. This awareness changes everything. It sharpens their perception, making it harder to ignore behaviors they once overlooked. What they once excused as just the way someone is now feels like something they can no longer accept. As they grow, they also become more honest with themselves. They begin to ask deeper questions. Does this connection feel genuine? Do I feel respected here? Am I able to be myself? Or am I constantly adjusting to maintain this relationship? And when the answers start to reveal discomfort or imbalance, they can no longer pretend otherwise. This is where the distance begins, not because they want to lose people, but because they can no longer stay the same version of themselves that once fit into those dynamics. One of the most difficult parts of this process is that not everyone grows at the same pace. While the empath is evolving, reflecting, and becoming more self-aware, others may remain in the same patterns. Some people avoid self-reflection altogether. They resist change, deny their own behaviors, or continue to engage in dynamics that the empath has already moved beyond. This creates a natural disconnect. It is not always dramatic or confrontational, it is often subtle. Conversations start to feel out of sync. Values begin to differ. Priorities no longer align. And without any clear conflict, the connection simply starts to fade. For the empath, this can feel deeply emotional. They do not take relationships lightly, and they do not let go easily. There is often a period of internal conflict where they question themselves, wonder if they are being too sensitive, or try to hold on longer than they should. They may attempt to reconnect, to communicate, to find a way to preserve what once existed, but growth has a way of making certain things impossible to return to. Once awareness expands, it does not shrink back. Once they see the truth of a connection, they cannot go back to seeing it the same way. There is also a sense of grief that comes with outgrowing people. Even when the distance is necessary, it does not mean it is painless. The empath remembers what the relationship once was, the moments of connection, the shared experiences. Letting go is not about forgetting. It is about accepting that something no longer fits the person they are becoming. This kind of loss is quiet but powerful. It is not always visible to others, but internally, it can feel like closing a chapter that once meant everything. At the same time, there is a deeper truth unfolding beneath the surface. As the empath releases connections that no longer align, they create space. Space for clarity, for peace, and eventually, for more meaningful relationships. What they lose in quantity, they gain in quality. They begin to understand that not every connection is meant to last forever. Some people are part of a phase, a lesson, or a moment in time, rather than a lifelong presence. And recognizing this allows them to let go with more acceptance, even if it still carries emotion. Growth also strengthens their sense of self. As they step away from relationships that required them to shrink, adjust, or overgive, they begin to stand more firmly in who they are. They become less afraid of being alone and more focused on being aligned. This shift is powerful because it removes the fear that once kept them in situations that did not serve them. They no longer stay out of habit, guilt, or the need to be understood. Instead, they choose based on what feels right for their well-being and their growth. What makes this journey even more complex is that from the outside, it can look like the empath is constantly losing people. Others may not understand why their circle is getting smaller, why they are becoming more selective, or why they are no longer as available as they once were. Some may even take it personally, interpreting the distance as rejection. But in reality, it is not about rejecting others. It is about no longer rejecting themselves. It is about honoring the person they are becoming, even if it means walking a path that feels more solitary. Over time, the empath begins to find peace in this process. They realize that outgrowing people is not a flaw, it is a sign of evolution. It means they are no longer stuck in cycles that limit them. It means they are choosing growth over comfort, truth over familiarity. And while this path can feel lonely at times, it also leads to something deeper, a life that feels more authentic, more aligned, and more true to who they really are. In the end, outgrowing people is not about leaving others behind. It is about moving forward. It is about recognizing that as you change, your environment must change with you. And for a rare empath, this is not a one-time experience, it is an ongoing journey. A journey of becoming, of refining, of stepping into a version of themselves that can no longer fit into spaces that once felt like home. And while that can be difficult, it is also where their true strength begins to show. For a rare empath, solitude is not something to escape from. It is something they eventually learn to understand, respect, and even rely on. In the beginning, being alone can feel uncomfortable, especially in a world that constantly promotes connection, social validation, and external engagement. Like anyone else, they may once have believed that being surrounded by people automatically meant being fulfilled. But over time, through experience, emotional exhaustion, and deep self-awareness, they begin to realize something important. Not all company is nourishing, and not all silence is empty. In fact, for them, solitude slowly transforms into something entirely different. It becomes a power source. This shift does not happen overnight. It develops through moments of emotional overwhelm, misunderstood intentions, draining relationships, and the quiet realization that constantly giving energy to others without receiving anything meaningful in return leads to inner depletion. Rare empaths often absorb more than they express. They carry emotional weight that is not always theirs, and over time, this accumulation creates a need for retreat. At first, they may resist it. They may try to stay engaged, stay available, and stay connected, even when their inner world is asking for rest. But eventually, their system demands balance, and that balance is found in solitude. When they finally allow themselves to be alone without guilt, something begins to change. The silence that once felt uncomfortable slowly becomes grounding. There are no expectations, no emotional demands, no need to read between the lines of someone else's behavior. In solitude, the empath no longer has to decode hidden meanings or manage the emotional atmosphere around them. Instead, they can simply exist, and in that simplicity, clarity begins to return. Their thoughts, which may have once felt scattered due to external emotional input, start to settle. They begin to differentiate between what they truly feel and what they have absorbed from others. This is a crucial part of their healing process. In social environments, empaths often take on emotions that do not belong to them, mistaking them for their own. But in solitude, that confusion fades. They begin to reconnect with their own emotional identity. They start to understand their real needs, their real boundaries, and their real desires without outside influence. Solitude also becomes a space of healing, not just emotional healing, but energetic restoration. After long periods of giving, understanding, supporting, and absorbing, they need time to release what they have carried. In alone time, they are no longer responsible for anyone else's emotions. There is no pressure to respond, to fix, or to explain. This absence of demand allows their nervous system and emotional state to settle. It is in these quiet moments that they begin to rebuild themselves from within, piece by piece, without external interference. Another powerful aspect of solitude for rare empaths is self-connection. In the presence of others, especially in emotionally complex environments, they often focus outward on how others feel, what others need, and how to maintain balance in relationships. But in solitude, that direction shifts inward. They begin to notice themselves more clearly. Their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own inner voice becomes louder and more distinguishable. This is where self-awareness deepens. They start recognizing patterns in their behavior, understanding their emotional triggers, and becoming more conscious of their personal growth journey. What once may have felt like loneliness gradually transforms into a form of empowerment. They begin to realize that being alone does not mean being disconnected. Instead, it can mean being deeply connected to oneself, and that connection is something they may not have fully experienced when constantly surrounded by external energies. In solitude, they are no longer performing emotional roles or adjusting themselves to fit into different dynamics. They are simply being, and in that state of authenticity, they begin to regain strength. Over time, they also learn that solitude helps them reset their emotional boundaries. After spending time alone, they return to the world with more clarity about what they will and will not accept. Their intuition becomes sharper. They can sense more quickly when something feels off or when a connection is not aligned. This is because solitude clears emotional noise, allowing their inner perception to function without interference. There is also a subtle but important shift in how they view loneliness itself. Instead of seeing it as something negative, They begin to understand it as a natural part of their rhythm. Just as the body needs rest after exertion, the empathic mind and heart need stillness after emotional engagement. They stop resisting this need and start honoring it, and in doing so, they prevent burnout, emotional confusion, and energetic exhaustion. Interestingly, the more they embrace solitude, the less dependent they become on external validation. They no longer feel the need to constantly be understood by others in order to feel valid. They begin to trust their own perception more than outside opinions. This internal stability becomes one of their greatest strengths. It allows them to move through relationships and life with more confidence, less fear, and greater emotional balance. However, it is important to understand that this transformation does not mean they reject connection altogether. Rather, they become more intentional about it. They do not isolate themselves out of fear, but they choose solitude out of wisdom. When they do connect with others, it is from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. They are no longer seeking to be completed by relationships. They are simply sharing their presence with those who genuinely align with them. In this way, solitude becomes not just a space of recovery, but a foundation of strength. It is where they rebuild, where they realign, and where they remember who they are without external influence. It is where their emotional depth becomes clearer, not heavier, and it is where they realize that they were never truly weak for needing alone time. They were simply sensitive enough to understand when it was time to return to themselves. In the end, being alone is not their downfall. It is their reset. It is their clarity. It is their protection. And most importantly, it is their power source, a place where they do not lose themselves, but continuously find themselves again, stronger and more aware each time they return. For a rare empath, learning to set boundaries is not just a personal improvement, it is a complete shift in how they experience relationships. For a long time, many empaths grow up believing that being kind means being available, that being understanding means tolerating everything, and that saying no might hurt others or create conflict. Because of this, they often overextend themselves emotionally, giving second chances, absorbing emotional pressure, and staying in situations longer than they should. But as they grow more self-aware, something begins to change. They start to understand that kindness without boundaries is not love. It is self-neglect. And this is where their transformation truly begins. At first, saying no feels uncomfortable. It does not come naturally, especially for someone who is deeply attuned to the feelings of others. There is often guilt, hesitation, or fear of being misunderstood. They may worry about disappointing people or being seen as cold or distant. But over time, with experience and emotional maturity, they begin to realize that every yes they give to others at the cost of their own peace is a silent no to themselves. This realization becomes a turning point. It shifts their perspective from pleasing others to protecting their energy. When an empath finally begins to set clear boundaries, the dynamics around them start to change quickly, especially with toxic personalities. Narcissistic individuals, in particular, often struggle when they no longer have unrestricted emotional access. In the past, they may have relied on the empath's openness, patience, and willingness to forgive repeatedly. They may have tested limits, pushed emotional buttons, or expected constant understanding without accountability. But once the empath starts to say no, the pattern is interrupted. What once felt predictable becomes unavailable. This is where discomfort begins for those who are used to control or emotional entitlement. A boundary is not just a refusal, it is a mirror. It reflects behavior back to the person initiating it. When an empath says, "I cannot accept this," or "this does not work for me," it removes ambiguity. It creates clarity. And for someone who depends on emotional flexibility or manipulation, that clarity feels threatening. Suddenly, the dynamic no longer revolves around their needs alone. There is now a line they cannot cross without consequence. For the empath, this shift can feel intense at first. Some relationships begin to change immediately. People who were used to unlimited access may become distant, frustrated, or even reactive. There may be attempts to guilt them, to question their decision, or to make them feel like they are being unfair. But what is really happening is simple. Access is being restricted. And when access is restricted, people who benefited from lack of boundaries often lose interest or control. However, not all reactions are loud or dramatic. Sometimes the change is subtle. Conversations become less frequent. Certain people naturally drift away. Invitations stop coming. But instead of being a loss, this becomes a form of clarity. The empath begins to see which connections were based on genuine respect, and which ones depended on emotional availability without limits. It becomes easier to distinguish between mutual relationships and one-sided dynamics. What is often misunderstood is that setting boundaries does not make the empath less loving. It makes their love more intentional. They are no longer giving from exhaustion or obligation. They are giving from choice, and anything that requires them to abandon themselves in order to maintain it is no longer acceptable. This is a powerful internal shift. It means they are no longer negotiating their well-being for the comfort of others. As boundaries strengthen, something unexpected happens. The number of relationships often decreases, but their quality improves significantly. At first glance, this might feel like loss. Fewer conversations, fewer social connections, fewer emotional entanglements. But in reality, what remains is more stable, more respectful, and more aligned. The empath is no longer surrounded by people who drain them, confuse them, or rely on emotional imbalance. Instead, they begin to attract or maintain relationships that understand mutual respect and emotional space. This process also brings a deeper sense of inner peace. Without constant emotional overextension, the empath has more energy for themselves. Their mind feels less cluttered, their emotions feel more stable, and their intuition becomes clearer. They are no longer constantly recovering from interactions that leave them drained. Instead, they begin to experience relationships that feel lighter, more balanced, and more authentic. There is also an important psychological shift that happens within them. They begin to realize that not everyone deserves unlimited access to their emotional world. Trust becomes something earned rather than automatically given. This does not make them cold, it makes them discerning. They are no longer operating from a place of emotional urgency or fear of rejection. Instead, they are grounded in self-respect. For narcissistic or toxic personalities, this change often marks the end of influence. Where there was once emotional flexibility, there is now structure. Where there was once tolerance for manipulation or inconsistency, there is now awareness and refusal. And without the ability to cross emotional boundaries, these individuals often disengage. Not because the empath pushed them away aggressively, but because they can no longer operate in the same way. It is important to understand that this transformation is not about creating distance for the sake of isolation. It is about creating clarity for the sake of well-being. The empath is not shutting the world out, They are simply no longer allowing the world to enter without respect. And this distinction changes everything. Over time, they begin to trust their boundaries more. Each time they say no and remain grounded in it, their confidence grows. They realize that boundaries are not barriers to love. They are protections for it. Without boundaries, love becomes exhaustion. With boundaries, love becomes sustainable. In the end, learning to say no is one of the most powerful shifts a rare empath can make. It removes confusion from relationships. It eliminates emotional exploitation. And it replaces chaos with clarity. While it may result in fewer connections, those connections are no longer based on imbalance. They are based on respect, awareness, and mutual understanding. And in that space, the empath finally begins to experience relationships that do not require self-sacrifice to survive, but instead support their growth, peace, and emotional truth. For a rare empath, peace is not something optional or occasional. It becomes a necessity for survival. Over time, through experience, emotional exhaustion, and repeated exposure to chaotic or manipulative environments, they begin to understand a simple but powerful truth. Not every environment deserves their presence, and not every relationship deserves their energy. While many people may chase popularity, attention, or social validation, the empath slowly shifts in a completely different direction. They begin to prioritize peace over everything else. This shift does not happen suddenly. It develops through moments where they feel emotionally drained after interactions that others might consider normal. It shows up when conversations feel heavy instead of uplifting, when relationships feel confusing instead of clear, and when social environments begin to feel more like emotional work than genuine connection. At first, they may try to adjust, to adapt, to understand, and to stay involved. But the more they experience emotional imbalance, the more they realize that constant exposure to chaos comes at a cost, one that affects their mental clarity, emotional stability, and even their physical energy. Empaths are naturally sensitive to emotional energy. They do not just hear words, they feel tone, intention, and underlying emotion. Because of this, chaotic environments affect them more deeply than others. A space filled with drama, manipulation, gossip, or emotional inconsistency does not just feel unpleasant, it feels overwhelming. It creates internal noise, making it difficult for them to think clearly or stay grounded. While others may become used to such environments or even thrive in them socially, empaths begin to feel a growing sense of discomfort. This discomfort eventually turns into awareness. They start noticing patterns: who creates tension, who thrives on conflict, who drains emotional energy, and who brings stability. With this awareness comes choice. They begin to step back from situations that repeatedly leave them feeling unsettled, not because they are avoiding people, but because they are protecting their internal balance. They realize that constantly being available to chaos is a form of self-neglect. As this understanding deepens, something important begins to change in their priorities. The desire to be liked by everyone starts to fade. The need to be included in every group or social circle loses its importance. What once felt necessary for belonging no longer feels worth the emotional cost. Instead, they begin to value something far more meaningful: peace, and not just temporary calm, but a stable, consistent sense of inner quiet where they can think clearly, feel grounded, and simply exist without emotional disruption. This is where the idea of popularity begins to lose its appeal. Popularity often comes with visibility, and visibility often comes with exposure to diverse, sometimes chaotic energies. For an empath, this can quickly become overwhelming. Being known by many people does not automatically mean feeling understood or safe. In fact, the more attention or social engagement they receive, the more they may feel emotionally scattered. They begin to realize that being surrounded by people does not guarantee emotional fulfillment. So they start choosing differently. Instead of attending every gathering, engaging in every conversation, or maintaining every connection, they become more selective. They begin to observe how they feel after interactions. Do they feel energized or drained? Do they feel respected or overlooked? Do they feel calm or anxious? These internal questions become their guide, and slowly, they start removing themselves from environments that consistently disrupt their peace. This process is not always understood by others. From the outside, it may look like withdrawal, isolation, or disinterest. Some may even interpret it as arrogance or detachment, but in reality, it is self-preservation. The empath is not rejecting people, they are rejecting emotional chaos. They are choosing to step away from patterns that repeatedly disturb their inner stability. One of the most powerful realizations they come to is that peace is not something that happens by chance. It is something that must be protected. Without boundaries, without awareness, and without conscious choice, peace can easily be replaced by emotional confusion. And once they understand this, they begin to treat their energy as something valuable, something not to be wasted on environments that do not honor it. This also changes how they view relationships. Instead of seeking large social circles, they begin to value depth over quantity. A few genuine, calm, and emotionally safe connections become more important than being part of many unstable or superficial ones. They no longer feel pressured to maintain relationships that drain them just for the sake of belonging. Instead, they allow connections to fade naturally when they no longer feel aligned. As peace becomes their priority, their inner world also begins to transform. They become more reflective, more grounded, and more self-aware. Without constant emotional disruption, they gain clarity about who they are and what they need. Their thoughts become less scattered, their emotions more stable, and their intuition stronger. They begin to trust themselves more deeply because they are no longer constantly influenced by external chaos. This does not mean their life becomes empty or disconnected. Instead, it becomes intentional. They choose environments that support calmness. They choose conversations that feel meaningful. They choose relationships that are balanced and respectful. And most importantly, they choose themselves. This self-choosing is what truly defines their transformation. Even when faced with pressure to be more social, more available, or more engaged, they remain grounded in their new understanding. They no longer feel obligated to participate in dynamics that harm their peace. They recognize that being present in every space is not necessary for a fulfilling life. What matters is being present in the right spaces, those that align with their emotional well-being. In the end, valuing peace over popularity is not about avoiding the world. It is about choosing how they exist within it. It is about recognizing that constant emotional noise is not normal, and that silence, clarity, and calmness are not luxuries, they are essential. For a rare empath, peace becomes the foundation of everything. It guides their choices, shapes their relationships, and defines their boundaries. And while the world may continue to value attention and visibility, the empath learns something deeper. True strength is not found in being seen by everyone, but in being at peace with oneself. For a rare empath, one of the most important realizations in life is that their depth is not something everyone can reach, understand, or even recognize. This is not about superiority or separation, it is about alignment. Their emotional world is layered, sensitive, and highly aware. They do not just experience life on a surface level, they feel meaning beneath words, intentions behind actions, and emotional truth beyond appearances. Because of this, they often find themselves in situations where they feel misunderstood, even when they are surrounded by people. In the beginning, they may try to explain themselves more, give more of their energy, or adjust their communication so others can understand them better. They might overthink their expressions, soften their emotions, or simplify their thoughts just to be heard. But over time, something becomes clear. It is not always about how they express themselves, it is about whether the other person is capable of receiving that depth. And this is where the shift begins. Rare empaths operate from emotional awareness that is intuitive and layered. They notice subtle changes in tone, energy shifts in conversation, and unspoken emotional cues. Their understanding of people is often deep and immediate, but not everyone processes relationships or emotions in the same way. Many people operate on a more surface level, focusing on direct communication, visible behavior, and immediate needs. Neither approach is wrong, but the difference between them creates a gap. And that gap is often where misunderstanding begins. This is why rare empaths often feel out of place in many social environments. They may engage, participate, and even connect temporarily, but something within them feels like it is not fully being met. Conversations may feel incomplete, interactions may feel shallow, and relationships may lack emotional depth. It is not that people are unkind or unworthy, it is simply that the level of emotional awareness is different. And when depth is not matched, connection becomes limited. As they grow more self-aware, empaths begin to notice this pattern more clearly. They realize that not every connection is meant to go deep. Some relationships are meant for lightness, for everyday interaction, or for shared experiences without emotional intensity. But they also recognize that their inner world requires something more meaningful to feel truly fulfilled. They need honesty, emotional presence, and a sense of being truly seen beyond surface identity. This awareness brings both clarity and acceptance. Instead of forcing depth where it does not naturally exist, they begin to observe people more realistically. They stop expecting everyone to understand them at the same level. They begin to accept that emotional intelligence varies, just like any other human trait. Some people are naturally more introspective and emotionally aware, while others are more practical, external, or experience-focused. Understanding this helps them reduce disappointment and emotional frustration. However, this realization also brings a sense of solitude, not because they are unloved or disconnected, but because truly deep emotional resonance becomes rare. They may meet many people, form many connections, and interact frequently, but only a few will feel truly aligned with their inner world. This can feel isolating at times, especially in moments when they long for deeper understanding. But over time, they begin to see this not as a flaw, but as a reality of emotional difference. One of the most powerful changes that happens within them is acceptance. They stop trying to fit their depth into spaces that cannot hold it. Instead of shrinking themselves to maintain connection, they begin to honor their emotional nature. They realize that their sensitivity, intuition, and emotional intelligence are not problems to fix. They are qualities that simply require the right environment to thrive. This is where the idea of "not everyone is meant to meet them there" becomes important. It is not rejection, it is recognition. Just as some people are naturally inclined toward logic, structure, or simplicity, empaths are inclined toward emotional depth, reflection, and subtle understanding. These differences shape how relationships form and evolve. When both sides are aligned, connection feels effortless. When they are not, distance becomes natural.